Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Intelligent Enterprise Storytellers. My name is Rob Shannon. I'm the Managing Director and founder of the Intelligent Enterprise Leaders Alliance. It's my absolute pleasure today to welcome Deborah Mcfarlane to the program. Deborah is the Chief Human Resources Officer at KBS Services. Deborah is also one of our featured speakers at the upcoming People Analytics Exchange taking place in late June in Minneapolis. Deborah, welcome to Storytellers.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. It's great to be here.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. We've got a lot to cover. I want to encourage everyone out there to ask questions. If we have time, we're certainly going to do our best to get to them. I think that makes for a really engaging conversation when we can take questions and comments from the community at large. And there's a lot of you out there. So thank you for joining us as well. Before we jump in, Deborah, I wanted you to just maybe for the group that might not be familiar with KBS to just talk a little bit about the company, what industry you're in, the customers that you serve, and maybe a little bit about the size and scope of the organization.
Yeah, no, happy to. So KBS is really a property services business. We employ anywhere from 40 to 50,000 people with in either the what I'll call the retail services, office services, industrial supply chain, et cetera, right? So think about anything you need to run a building from the parking lot all the way in. We supply the contractual labor to get the services done. So that's probably the Cliff Notes version of who we are, but we operate in all 50 states. We're also up in Canada as well, and we're located in Southern California.
Great. Well, thank you. I've always enjoyed learning a lot about different businesses. And it's interesting. I know when you and I first spoke, we talked a little bit about our backgrounds and that there's some similarities there. Specifically, you started out contemplating a career in law, but ultimately found yourself in HR via the operations space. And I was hoping you might be able to describe how that path led you to gain firsthand insights into the challenges that are faced both by the workforce, but also leadership.
Yeah, no. So it's really, I think I'm like most people, right? I went to school with this grandiose idea of what my career was going to be. And then I had this thought about what law was. And for me, it was advocacy. It was taking care of people. It was helping. And it was this notion of justice and fairness, right? Which I still believe it is. But as I went through college and actually spent a little bit of time in a law firm just to try to understand what the job was, I realized that a lot of the, I'll call them pomp and ceremony, part of the role wasn't really for me, and it wasn't really conducive for my personality. And so it was really important for me to find something that I could still connect with the advocacy and the fairness and doing what was right, but at the same time still be authentic and real to who I was and how I could make an impact. And so I fell into HR. And I don't think that is dissimilar to a lot of people, right? And so as I was putting myself through school, I ended up working in retail, led into an operations management role. And I will tell you, even to this day, there are lessons learned from that very early career around the operations space that really I use to this day, right? And so what I really got from the operations piece was a passion for frontline leadership. And I got this passion around still being that advocate for the people and still doing what was right and fair, but also doing what was right and fair for the company and the employee, right? And so to this day, I think what that operations part has really helped me with in HR is one, speaking the language of the business, right? I understand the vocabulary. And I think a lot of the time HR leaders get criticized, frankly, for not understanding the business and not speaking the terms. And so it was really great for me to be on the front line, having been there, done that, lived in their world. So it just meant that the solutions I was offering, the people strategies I were offering were really grassroots. And I just think it was really appreciated. And again, that notion of customer experience, employee experience, operational excellence just came to life. And again, those are lessons I learn and come back even 25 years later, right?
That's so interesting. And you touched on a lot there. There's so much to unpack just even in that response. And I really appreciate it, as I'm sure the employees do that work for KBS, to have someone that has gone through the types of experiences that you have and have an advocate for both the employee, but also the company. And I think a lot of HR people that I speak to are constantly facing that challenge of, that balance between corporate and the employee. And I'm sure it's very well and amongst the employees at KBS. So you talked a little bit about customer experience, employee experience, operational excellence, themes that we talk about all the time in Intelligent Enterprise. But the one I wanted to sort of jump into next is really maybe around the employee experience side of things. And I'm intrigued by the emphasis that you've placed on employee listening and listening strategies at KBS, and was hoping you might be able to share with our viewers today some of the things that you're doing, the process that you undertook to get them launched, and maybe some of the outcomes that you've seen so far.
Yeah, so I think a lot of the time when we talk about listening strategies, the first thing we think about is a survey, right? And that is absolutely core to what we do, and it's very important. But I do think it's really important to share listening is beyond a survey. It is the most important thing, I think, is your leadership team ready to listen and respond to whatever feedback that they're getting? And I know that sounds really, really basic, right? Because what sometimes happens is we, as a HR organization, we go out, we put out a survey, people either respond or not, and we're focused on the response rate. Okay. And it's very important that you get that broad sampling. But what's more important from my perspective, or equally as important and needs to run parallel paths, is that we make sure that the leaders are encouraging and ready to listen. And so in those moments where people have feedback that isn't necessarily on a survey, that people can respond appropriately, that the employee walks away feeling really heard. And so if you can put in what I call the expectations around frontline leaders listening and responding appropriately, when you come to the survey side, people will just automatically take your survey because they know that they're going to be heard and that their voice matters in those moments, right? So I think that's a really important thing to level set on, because we spent a tremendous amount of time up front on defining the role of the people leader in the listening to our people before we got to the launch of a survey, okay? The other piece that was really important for us was thinking about the employee journey across a series of milestones. And then, so when we did our surveying strategy, it was really along what I will call the first, 365 days. And this is this data piece, right? So when we thought about turnover, we said, what is the employee experience? When do we lose our people? For us, we lose folks first 90 days, not dissimilar to a lot of companies, but there's something happening in that first 90 days. And so what was the trigger point in the first 90 days? When did we want to tie the survey to get that sentiment and feeling? And then we went through and said, the next big milestone for us is 91 days, then it's 9 months, then it's 365 days. And so when we rolled out our strategy or our actual survey, it was about the first survey was around almost like a stay interview. Will you be here in 3 months? What will it take for you to leave? What will it take for you to stay? Very simple. Then we get into, the 91st day. It's like, has the trailer matched the movie? Everything we said during the recruiting process, are we living up to what we said, right? And it was more of a sentiment, trailer matching the movie question. As we start getting into the 9th month, it's more around, are we living up to your expectations as an employer? And as we get into the 365 days, now the sentiment is more around, what will it take for you to stay, 2 years, 3 years from now? Because for us, our data showed us that if I got you to 365 days, I had you for 5 years. So for us, it was so important to get you to the year so that I could keep you for the 5. And we needed to survey along the way. And so that's how we approach the strategy and the approach. But for us, it had to be listening first from our leaders, two-way dialogue, and helping people appropriately respond to any feedback that was coming, plus the HR stuff, right, around the employee surveys as we went. So that's how we approached it at KBS.
Again, so thank you. So much to unpack there. I've got so many questions for you as a follow-up. And the first one is the leadership pushback, if any, that may be you experienced or not? I mean, I can imagine some organizations, everyone thinks that these kinds of things that you just described are great ideas, absolutely want to listen to what employees have to say. But perhaps upon reflection, there's sometimes these instances where leadership is maybe afraid about what they're going to hear. So can you talk maybe about the culture challenges, if there were any, in trying to get leadership on board to just even embrace the program? And then obviously there were a lot of great outcomes there, but talk to us a little bit about that, if you would.
Yeah, I think the best thing, the biggest, there was two big obstacles for us. I'd say the first one was leaders, and I want to be careful how I say this. When you have long tenured leaders, they have a lot of beliefs about how their company is performing, and they're often a projection of their own beliefs because, I've been here 20 years, I know how it works. And the warm sentiments that they have are often projected and believe that the newer folks coming in have the exact same sentiment, right? And I actually found this in previous companies where we had really top heavy tenured leadership and newer employees coming in. And it was interesting because when you would talk to the frontline employee and then you talk to the leader without doing a survey, polar opposites in terms of how folks thought things were going. And so I think what happens with some of your leaders is they have a belief and the data doesn't always match. And for them, it's personal, right? I mean, they've invested 20 years of their life in a company, for example, and so it hurts a little bit. And so what we really had to focus people on was, how do I say this? There's no emotional sentiment in an opinion. It's just an opinion. And what our job as leaders is to listen and to learn and to hear, and then look across the entire survey and think about how validating is it, right? And meaning this. What I found always was happening is, in the absence of having a survey, you have the amplified voices of a few and the loudest. And the other folks that are just, coming to work every day doing their job don't feel heard, and they are disengaged and not connecting in the same way. And so what we found happen is when we started saying to people, or leaders, I should say, I hear that you have a network of people that you trust. We're going to use those people as part of our change management network. And so you're going to use those people differently than you have. They're not going to be your, hey, how's it going in the field? It's going to be, hey, this is what the survey told us. What do you think? And so you still get your connection points of the people you trust, because that was really important to the leaders. But at the same time, we were getting the sample size of the entire organization. But now we were taking the tenure of the people who had really great feedback and using them in a much more productive way. So that was probably the biggest obstacle, but then that's how we pivoted the leaders to get them to focus more on what the entire organization was telling us, not just the amplified voices of a few.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm imagining there's a lot of people out there right now that are just shaking their head in agreement with the things that you just said, that are experiencing the same thing. So really appreciate you diving in deeper. You mentioned two things also in that answer about data, change management, two sort of things, again, that we focus on quite a bit. I wanted to dive into maybe some of the communication challenges that you've encountered with data. You spent a couple of minutes there talking about that as a key part of the listening strategy. And I was curious about how you manage the perceptions from the rest of the C-suite on the data that you're gathering from employees through these projects that you just talked about, with the time that's needed for the frontline leaders to explore those comments and then take action if action is actually required on whatever has been defined as the priorities. So again, lots to unpack in that question there, but definitely curious about some of those things, if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. The first one that I encountered with my peer group was really around this notion. It's an interesting one, that HR people shouldn't be talking about data. We should be talking about culture, people's experiences, and, what I call warm, fuzzy, sentimental things, right? And so the first obstacle we really had to overcome was, why are we even talking about this in the first place? because people could not reconcile this concept that data and HR even belong together in the first place, which is interesting considering everything we do is data based, right? And so the first thing we actually did was change the vocabulary, and it was a small, slight nuance change, but it changed the discussion. And so the first thing we did was we no longer use the word data. We said employee insights. We said, okay, moving forward, because people were so hung up on this, data is scientific, HR is people and warm and fuzzy, and they just couldn't connect the two, right? Which is, again, very interesting. And so when we changed the words to employee insights, and where we started saying, okay, data comes in many forms. It comes in a survey, it comes in a report, it comes in dialogue. And so what we had to really try and get people to realize is data is just an input, and it has different sources, right? So meaning we focus heavily on, hey, we have the survey as employee insights, and then we had the dialogue to validate with our employees, therefore it's all employee insights. And so as we started framing it that way, leaders were now, it connected with their version or their thoughts on what HR should be focused on, right? And frankly, it was the same stuff. We just, right? I mean, it's always very interesting what resonates with people. And so that's how we framed it. And then we were very clear that the employee insights is actually a measure of your culture. And so because we were putting it in those terms, people started listening, right? And so now that engagement score that came back at 70% was now suddenly a reflection of the culture on your team based on your employee insights, which is very different than the survey told us and the data says this, right? So that was the first thing. And again, it's slightly nuanced and probably a little silly, but it just changed, you could see the instant shift in the dialogue and the thinking of the leaders, right? The other thing too is when we selected the tool that we were going to use, we were very specific that we were doing quarterly touch points, 10 questions, 8 of the same questions every time, because that's frankly what we needed. And then the other 2 was something that was relevant and happening in the business right now. And it piques people's interest, right? Because I want to give feedback. Hey, we just did a restructuring. I want to tell the business teams how this is going. And so we ended up getting lots of feedback about how recent initiatives were actually working. And that also piqued the interest because it was no longer the same 8 questions. I mean, that was your benchmark. But what was most important to people was, how are we doing right now? And what can I tweak? And it put this immediate action in place around those 2 questions, right? And so as we went through and we set it up, we made sure that the frontline leaders had access real time to the platform, so that they had the comments live, they had the participation rates live, and they had an action planning tool within it, so that it no longer was what I'll call a HR activity. It was leadership all the way through. You could drive it, you could get your comments. Hey, don't wait for HR to come tell you or give you the report. Go take action right away. You're that leader. And so we really try to empower people to go and, unless it was an enterprise issue, but if it's something local and specific, we're like, don't wait for us. Just go. Just go do what you need to do. And so that's really how we overcame it, because it became this part of people operations versus this HR thing that we did at corporate. And that's really how we approach that.
Again, so many interesting things that you've talked about there. The first one I want to circle back to was you talked a little bit about data and maybe that sort of chasm that exists sometimes with how HR people might be perceived, even how they might perceive themselves. You talked about warm and fuzzies versus data. I'm curious, sort of if you were giving advice to people that are out there watching today that maybe are struggling with that same perception. They feel like they're up against it. For years, we often heard HR talk about needing that seat at the table or wanting the seat at the table. And typically it would be a custom with the C-suites, right? Show me some data. Yeah. Show me, tell me, right? So now we're empowered. HR is empowered to collect the kind of data and use the data that you've talked about. But if you don't mind, maybe provide some mentoring and coaching to some of the folks that are out there that maybe are just starting their career in HR and who are looking to make the kind of impact that you've made via some of these projects that you've talked about today?
Yeah, I think the best thing I could advise folks is to connect everything back to the business and specifically, right? I think we can all pull out surveys and benchmarking that says, hey, the why do we do surveying? Because we can pull the math that says the higher your engagement score, the more revenue you get, right? We can conceptually, and your leaders conceptually understand that, right? However, it needs to go down to the granular level. Who are the people you serve? Who are the clients? However you term that in your organization. So if I'm a operations HR business partner, I started my career as a HR business partner, right? So I was on the front lines, right? And I grew my career through strategic HR business partner work. So it's just embedded, right? It's just how I end up thinking about it. But for me, the connection point was always going back to whether I was supporting IT, whether I was supporting operations. How do I take the value or the measure or the outcomes and tie it directly to that team, right? So, and I think sometimes we can all talk about the value of serving. We can talk about the high level value to the organization, but what is in it for the IT leader or the people, what is it in it for them specifically? And then how can you frame the improvements in a way? So for example, hey, I've looked at your turnover. Your turnover is, make it up, 80%, right? That's a terrible number, but we're illustrative here, right? I've noticed your turnover is 80%. Okay, great. I've looked at your employee survey data or insights, and here's what it tells me about some of the things. I've looked at the number 4 reasons why you were losing people. And hey, by the way, it all ticks and ties. So let's talk about a plan of how I can get you and work side by side with you to get your plan down to get your turnover down to 40%. And here's what we're going to do together, right? Because now it becomes this real thing that I have an action, I have a specific action to help your team, and there's a business outcome that leader can understand and get wrapped around. And they're going to work side by side with you. And as that HR business partner, you are now the person that's going to go back to your COEs. And if it's new recruiting that you need, if it's new, training, et cetera, you're the one who's going to be on the forefront working with that leader. Which now only increases the relevance and the importance of the HR team to that business leader, right? And so if there's any advice, especially when you're in that HR business partner space, it's be so specific and connected to the business priorities of that team that you become, your solutions become relevant to improving their team's performance, right? And that is most critical from my perspective.
Everyone can look like a hero, and a win is a win, right? A win is a win. Before we move on, and there's another segment we're going to talk about here in a moment about AI. Everyone wants to talk about AI and the impact, and we're going to get to that, I promise. But I'm wondering and guessing a lot of other people are curious, as I am, about some other tangible wins that you might be able to share with us. You talked about getting people, sort of in that almost stay interview from the 90 days, and then you knew at certain intervals you'd have them for 5 years. Yep. Outside of that, were there any other tangible outcomes that you saw that were maybe quick wins or things that just surfaced as being organizational victories?
Yeah, there was one. We had a series of what I'll call talent programs that came out of it, but a really interesting thing that came through it is, probably 2 big wins out of the gate. We realized we were losing people around the 10th day. And so can you imagine putting in all this time and effort into hiring and training, and then on the 10th day, people are like, no, thank you, right? And so what we really realized is this realistic job preview. We weren't doing a great job at it. And so it totally changed the candidate experience. And what we ended up doing was reaching out to a virtual reality company. We're not using the virtual reality with the headsets, but just creating the videos around, this is what your job looks like. And we found if the fallout rate, so it's, again, early innings, but it's beginning to show some promises that people are self-selecting out as a candidate versus us hiring them and then selecting out at the 10th day. Now, what the positive is people are saying, I don't want to do that job, but if another job that looks like 1, 2, 3 is available, then please consider me. So we're not losing the candidate. And so that is an example of things that had happened. And so that's one really quick positive win we were able to put in place. And then another one, we got some really great insight into the pay progression through our organization. And so what we learned very quickly is, we pay better than market for the talent pool in which we hire from. But, there is a physical element to the work that we are doing. So what we learned very quickly is if people's discontent started around the 60 days. And so what we realized is if we did what I'm calling a progressive pay by tenure, and we put in, a process that once you've completed X amount of hours, you get X amount of a percentage of a raise, et cetera. And we did that through the first 2 years of employment. Now we're only in the 6th month, but already it's showing a significant drop in turnover in those first, like I said, we've only been doing it for 6 months now, but it was such an easy fix. It was a 2-week huddle. We got together, we got the business, the CFO to sign off. We went back to the customer. They're like, yes, absolutely. Let's get retention. And then we were able to put it in through Workdays to systemize it. And within 2 weeks, we were live and going. So that's the kind of things that on-demand, on-time data gets you, that we were able to take really quick action and move forward.
Thank you. I know I put you on the spot there, but I appreciate that because I was curious myself. So the last segment of our conversation today is going to touch on AI. It was a good segue. You mentioned technology in that last sort of segment. And I know you guys are piloting a high volume recruiting program at the moment. And I was hoping that you could elaborate on how that initiative in talent acquisition is streamlining communication between candidates, recruiters, and hiring managers.
Yeah. So current state for us, decentralized model. We have about 1,200 frontline leaders, all dispersed across the U.S. and Canada. And so, as you can imagine, a decentralized hiring model for high volume when you're hiring anywhere from, 30 to 50,000 people a year, it's a lot, right? And because the way our contracts work, business rolls off. And so you have to do a very specific workforce planning so that you can make sure that you're meeting the demands of the business, right? And so heavy reliance on local leadership. And so obviously we're like, there has to be a better way. We realize that our frontline leaders are spending anywhere from 15 to 20% of their time doing hiring and onboarding, right? And considering we really want them in front of customers and leading business, probably, there was a better way to do this, right? And so what we have done is, so it's a bit interesting. So we didn't want to invest in the technology first. What we said is, okay, what do we have? And so what we have is a applicant tracking system, which honestly was not connected to, a career site. I'm probably not painting a great picture here, but, it's important to understand where we are and where we're going, right? And so what we had is an applicant tracking system, which was, I'll call it rudimentary, and probably was an electronic filing system. And then we had what I'll call a proprietary, a proprietary system on how to onboard. And then we put folks into Workday, and 3 unconnected systems, decentralized model. I mean, you can imagine, and I'm sure every HR person on here today is a little like, yikes, wow, yeah. And so what we said is, okay, let's figure out a model where we can get 40,000 people through. What is the right candidate experience? And we defined the experience all the way through. And then we said, what can we do right now? Because we needed to prove out that this was actually going to work. And so what we said is we mapped out all the processes, we mapped out all the SOPs, and then we went to Appcast, which is a aggregator, right? And essentially what we did is we said, okay, help us with our postings and maximize our marketing dollars. And we essentially said, okay, we spend X amount today, same amount of postings, same amount of dollars. So that way the business is not spending more. Because again, we're proving out here, right? And so what we did is we built job postings instead of job descriptions. I mean, so we did a lot with what I call the candidate marketing experience. But the positive now is we had some data, right? Because before, when you have an applicant tracking system that's not connected, you don't know days to fill. You don't know how long the job, where it's been posted. You don't know any of those things. So now we actually had data and conversion rates. We had data on how much we were spending, what was the best sources and pools. So that was good. And then we said, okay, what can we actually do with the ATS we have? So we connected it, right? Crazy, I know. And so we said, okay, let's actually use this better. What we didn't fix, though, is the onboarding, because that is still something that would require a lot of effort. And so we said, okay, well, how do we get capacity to get through these 40, 50,000 people a year to hire? And so what we did, we went and outsourced to a RPO. We created all of the, again, the processes, SOPs, et cetera. So when those recruiters are calling, it actually feels like it's a KBS employee, and we have a project manager local. Now, the thing that's really tough, because we don't have a fully fledged ATS, there's still a lot of manual processes between the three, right? Because when you qualify the person, I'm having to reach out to the frontline leader to say, hey, I got 4 great candidates. Can you interview and can you take the folks? That is not where we want to be in the long term, but again, we're proving out right now. So what we've been able to do is get about 47 sites onto the model. And what it's really showed us is that because we're putting a lot of effort into the marketing of the jobs, we're getting the right candidates coming in, we're getting more candidates coming in with the same dollars. And the people, because we've now added that realistic job preview, which was one of the lessons learned from both the surveying and the actual turnover in that experience, what we are now able to do is that first 10 days turnover I was referencing, we've actually cut that down in half, right? Which is a big deal for us. And then the overall in the first 90 days, our turnover has gone down by 70%, right? So that for us is big, and it's showing us that the model is working. So now I just have to start thinking about what is the right system, what is the right AI, the machine learning, all of that to put this in place so that I can take the human touch out. In the right spaces, I should say, not all of the human touch. And so that's what we've been working on. And so still early innings, but it's showing great promise for us. It's just a huge opportunity because there's so many AI opportunity apps and technology out on the marketplace that we are going through a very robust evaluation process and deciding what are the right partners, because we now understand exactly what's happening, what do we need, and then what we can actually put through AI and what we can put through machine learning. So that's a very long answer. I apologize, but it's just a very recent, and these are some of the learnings that we're getting right now.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah, for sharing. I can't believe we're up on time. This is unfortunately our stopping point for the interview, but that is a great segue to your session that we're going to be hearing about at People Analytics Exchange. So for all of you out there that enjoyed this content, you're definitely going to want to come out and hear more from Deborah and the other speakers that we have. But today, I want to thank you, Deborah, so much for joining us. I really appreciate it, as I'm sure everyone did that participated. Deborah Mcfarlane, Chief Human Resources Officer at KBS Services. Come out and see us in June at the People Analytics Exchange. Thanks so much, Deborah.
Great. Thank you.
Take care.